It is Sunday night. You are sitting on your bed. Your phone is in your hand. You are looking at your bank balance. And you are doing the same calculation you have done every Sunday night for longer than you want to admit. Rent, car payment, groceries, utilities, phone bill. And at the end of the calculation, the answer is always the same. Not enough. Not quite enough. Never quite enough. You put the phone down. You stare at the ceiling. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question forms. Is this just how it is? Is this what my life looks like now? Is this what it looks like for the next 10 years? You are not reckless. You know you are not reckless. You have been working since you were young. You have never asked for a handout. You have cut the expenses. You have skipped the nights out. You have done everything the advice said to do. And still, every Sunday night, the same ceiling, the same calculation, the same answer. Here is what most financial advice will never tell you. The problem is not effort. Most working people trying to escape low income are already working extremely hard. The hours are there, the sacrifice is there, the discipline is there, and still the number barely moves. The problem is not effort. The problem is architecture. Working harder inside a broken structure produces the same result every time. Not progress. Exhaustion. Warren Buffett has spent more than 6 decades studying this exact pattern. Why some people build wealth from very little, and why others, working just as hard, sometimes harder, never seem to cross the line. His documented conclusion is this: the structure a person operates inside determines what their effort can produce. Buffett has described this using a simple image. If you are in a boat paddling against a current that is stronger than your arms, working harder does not get you to shore. It delays how long it takes to exhaust yourself. The answer is not more paddling. The answer is understanding which direction the current is flowing and repositioning yourself to move with it instead of against it. And here is what makes this worse. Financial pressure does not just drain your money. Research on cognitive function under financial stress has shown something striking. When a person is living under sustained financial pressure, their decision-making capacity measurably reduces every single day. You are trying to make the most important decisions of your life: career decisions, financial decisions, long-term planning. And you are making them with a brain that is already occupied, running a continuous calculation in the background. Is the balance enough? What happens if something breaks this week? Can I make it to the 15th? That calculation never stops. And every unit of mental energy it consumes cannot simultaneously be used for the thinking that could actually change your situation. This is the architecture. And it has 5 specific points where it breaks down for working people. Today, this video walks through all 5, using Warren Buffett's publicly documented framework. Applied not to billionaires, applied to working people building from exactly where they are. 5 principles: the buffer foundation, the consumption reset, the time ceiling, the environment principle, and the compounding crossing. Each one invisible until you understand it, each one dismantleable once you do. Let us go through all 5, starting with the one that makes everything else possible. Most financial advice starts with investing. Open a brokerage account, buy index funds, let compound interest work. And that advice is not wrong, but it is aimed at the wrong person. It is aimed at someone who already has stability, someone for whom an unexpected car repair is an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. For someone who does not have that stability yet, investment advice is like being told to build a skyscraper on a swamp. The skyscraper is a good idea, but not yet. First you drain the swamp. Buffett's documented framework on financial foundations returns to one idea more consistently than almost any other: stability before growth. Protection before accumulation. Stop the bleeding before building. Here is why this matters more than most people realize. Research on cognitive performance under financial pressure has produced a consistent finding. When a person is living under sustained financial stress, the ordinary kind, rent always a little too close, account always a little too low, their cognitive processing capacity measurably reduces. The magnitude of that reduction is comparable to the cognitive impact of losing a full night of sleep. Not occasionally, every single day. Think carefully about what that means. You are attempting to navigate the most consequential decisions of your life. where to work, what to prioritize, how to plan, what to spend. And you are making every one of those decisions with a brain running at significantly reduced capacity. Not because of anything wrong with you, because your brain is occupied. It is running a background process that never switches off. Is the balance going to cover this? What happens if something breaks this week? Can I make it to the 15th from here? Every hour of every day. This background process consumes cognitive bandwidth. And bandwidth consumed by financial threat assessment cannot simultaneously be used for the kind of thinking that changes a financial situation. This is the first thing Buffett's framework addresses. Not investment returns, not compound interest. The cognitive cost of operating without a financial floor. The practical application is specific, $1,000 in a separate account. That does not go below $1,000. Ever. Not an investment, not a savings goal with a target date. A floor, a number that does not move downward. When that floor exists, the unexpected car repair is an inconvenience, not a disaster. When that floor exists, the background threat assessment begins to quiet, because the answer to most of the questions it keeps running is now the same. I have a buffer. I can handle this. This does not collapse everything. That reduction in cognitive load is worth more than almost any financial return you could earn on that same money, because it gives you back the most valuable financial asset a working person can possess: the ability to think clearly about what comes next. Consider the mathematics of poverty that Buffett's framework references. A person with capital buys quality when they make a purchase. Quality lasts longer. Quality requires replacement less often. Quality costs less per year when you calculate the total. A person without capital buys the cheapest available option because that is what they can afford right now. The cheapest option degrades fastest. The cheapest option needs replacing soonest. The cheapest option, bought repeatedly over years, costs significantly more than the quality option purchased once. Over 10 years, the person with less capital has spent more money on the same category than the person who had more. The system charges a premium for the absence of capital. Late fees, overdraft charges, high-interest financing on necessities that cannot be paid outright. This is why the buffer comes first, not to earn returns, to stop paying the premium that the absence of capital costs. $1,000. Separate account. Does not go below $1,000. Build this before anything else. Protect it permanently. Everything in Buffett's framework that follows this step only works if this step exists first. The second principle is the one that generates the most judgment, from outside and from inside. You have heard the criticism before. If you are struggling financially, why do you spend on things you do not strictly need? Why the new phone? Why the restaurant meal when there is food at home? Why the branded item when the generic version costs a third of the price? It is an easy judgment to make from the outside. Here is what is actually happening on the inside. When a person has been living under sustained financial and social pressure for months or years, the body's stress response system remains in a low-level activated state. Not the acute panic of a crisis, not the alarm of an emergency, a dull, persistent, exhausting background pressure that is present when you wake up and present when you try to sleep. When a person has been in that state long enough, the brain begins doing something entirely predictable, looking for relief, fast relief, accessible relief, something that makes the pressure stop, even briefly. When you walk into a store and buy something you want, the brain registers a brief reward signal. The pressure lifts for a moment. Something went right. You had control over something. For one brief moment, the scarcity was gone. This is not irresponsibility. This is not laziness. This is the human brain doing exactly what biology designed it to do. Seeking relief from sustained pain. The problem is the equation. The relief lasts approximately 20 minutes. The financial consequence lasts months, sometimes years. And the cycle does not stay static. It deepens. More financial pressure creates more need for relief. More spending on relief creates more financial pressure. The marketing systems that surround working people understand this cycle with extraordinary precision. They are not selling products. They are selling relief. And they have spent decades learning exactly how to do it. Buffett's documented framework on this pattern identifies one core distinction between people who accumulate wealth and people who do not. It is not intelligence. It is not willpower in the conventional sense. It is what they believe money is fundamentally for. People inside the consumption cycle see money as a solution to the feeling of discomfort. Something is wrong. Money spent temporarily makes it less wrong. People who build wealth over time see money differently, not as relief, as raw material, not for purchasing comfort today, for building options over the next decade. Every dollar spent on a liability drains your present. Every dollar deployed toward an asset builds your future. The car financed at high interest, the subscription running unused. Every purchase made to feel successful while the account balance said otherwise. These are not moral failures. They are the predictable output of a system that keeps working people in chronic stress and then profits from how they respond. The reset Buffett's framework prescribes is a defined period, 6 months, not permanent. 6 months of radical simplification. Every non-essential expense eliminated, not as punishment, as a deliberate recalibration of what the brain finds rewarding. When consumption is removed as an option, the brain adapts. It begins to find satisfaction in the growing balance, in the expanding sense of options, in the quiet accumulation of financial capacity. That satisfaction is slower to arrive than the dopamine of a purchase, but it is more durable, and it costs nothing. 6 months. After which, your brain's relationship with money has fundamentally shifted, from spending toward relief, to accumulating toward freedom. Buffett has been more direct about this principle than almost any topic in his documented public career. The time for money equation is a ceiling, not a strategy. From the time most working people are old enough to understand money, they are given a simple equation. Time equals money. Want more money? Work more hours. The equation seems logical. It contains a mathematical flaw that compounds every year. Time is the one resource that is genuinely, absolutely finite. 24 hours in a day. Sleep is not optional. Biological requirements cannot be negotiated away. This means the time for money equation has a hard mathematical cap on the income it can ever produce, no matter how motivated, no matter how disciplined. The ceiling is built into the equation itself, and while income has a ceiling, costs do not. Every year, the price of everything a working person needs increases. Housing, food, healthcare, transportation. These costs compound upward. Wages are designed to lag behind them. Your employer does not adjust your rate the day prices rise. They review. They budget. Perhaps 12 months later, you receive an adjustment, by which time the purchasing power loss has already happened. You are not on flat ground. You are on a slope that tilts a little steeper every year. And the more hours you give to the time for money equation, the more you discover that the slope rises faster than the extra hours can compensate. Buffett's documented position on this is consistent across decades. The market does not pay for hours. The market pays for value. And value is determined by rarity. Common skills produce common prices. Rare combinations produce rare prices. The most achievable form of rarity is not becoming the world's best at a single discipline. That path is narrow and crowded. The most achievable form of rarity is a specific intersection. Two moderately developed skills in disciplines that do not typically overlap. A person who understands physical work and also understands sales is not in the same market as people who only understand one. They have created their own category. A smaller pool, less competition, higher price for their output. A person who understands administrative work and also understands data has left the market competing for their time. They have entered a market competing for their outcomes. That shift from time to outcomes is the entire mechanism by which the ceiling is removed. The 6-month period from the previous principle provides the time to build this. Expenses eliminated, hours freed, mental space restored by the buffer. Those freed hours used deliberately to build a second skill that complements what already exists, not to mastery, to functional competence at the intersection. That intersection is where the time ceiling breaks. And once it breaks, it does not come back. The fourth principle is the most personal, and the one Buffett has returned to most consistently throughout his documented career. The financial beliefs, behaviors, and outcomes of the people closest to you are among the strongest predictors of your own, not because of weakness, because of how human beings construct their understanding of what is normal and what is possible. We do not assess our own potential by examining data. We assess it by observing the people immediately around us. If everyone in your environment believes financial struggle is permanent, that ambition beyond a certain level is unrealistic, that the system is designed to keep people like you in place, those beliefs stop feeling like opinions. They feel like facts, like the way things simply are. And you absorb them without noticing, because they are not delivered as arguments, they are delivered as shared experience. The collective story of the group, and the collective story of a group becomes the individual ceiling of each member inside it. Here is the pattern Buffett's framework identifies. When one person inside such an environment begins to change their behavior, begins saving, begins acquiring new skills, begins making different choices, the group rarely celebrates this. The group resists it, not always consciously. The person changing becomes a kind of mirror, one that reflects back what the others have not done. Mirrors are uncomfortable, so pressure is applied. You are working too hard. You have changed. You think you are better than everyone now. The game is fixed anyway. Why put yourself through this? This pressure is not malicious. It comes from people who often genuinely care. But it is real, and for many people it is the final chain. Not money, not skills. The weight of the environment pulling in the opposite direction. The answer Buffett's framework gives is not to cut people off. It is to manage the ratio. You have a finite number of hours of mental exposure each week. The voices, perspectives, and belief systems that occupy the majority of those hours become the framework through which you interpret your own situation. If the majority of that mental input confirms that your circumstances are fixed, your mind operates as though they are fixed. Change the ratio. Study the documented decisions of people who navigated the same constraints you face and arrived at different outcomes. Study how they thought, not the inspirational summary, the actual mechanics of what they chose. Buffett's own documented history reflects this principle directly. His framework was shaped by the thinkers he deliberately chose to spend his mental time with, not always physically present, but dominant in his thinking. You cannot always change your physical environment immediately, but you can change what occupies the majority of your mental environment. And the mind, changed consistently over time, does eventually change the physical environment around it. This is one of the most documented patterns in Buffett's entire body of work. Manage the ratio, deliberately, every single day. The fifth principle is the one Buffett has called the most powerful force available to an ordinary person with patience. Compound interest. When money earns a return, and that return earns its own return, the growth curve bends upward. It accelerates. Time is the engine. The longer it runs, the more powerful it becomes. Here is the specific problem this creates for someone in low income. If you carry debt at a meaningful interest rate, this same principle is working against you. Every morning you wake up marginally worse off than when you went to sleep. Not because you spent anything, not because of any decision made yesterday, because the interest accrued. And the interest on the interest accrued while you slept, while you worked, while you did everything right. At the same time, someone on the other side of this equation woke up marginally better off, not because they worked, because their capital worked. This is what Buffett's framework calls the compounding crossing. Two forces, two directions, both silent, both accelerating. And until a person crosses from one side to the other, everything they earn is fighting a current that never stops flowing against them. The crossing happens in 3 stages, in order, without skipping. Stage 1, elimination. The savings from the 6-month reset go to the highest interest debt first, not the largest balance. The highest rate, the one compounding fastest against you. Eliminate it. Then the next. Every closed account is a drain permanently sealed. The current weakens with each one. Stage 2, accumulation. A consistent, modest, defined amount. $10 a day. $50 a month. Whatever the buffer and the reset make available. Placed into a broad, diversified, low-cost index fund. Not individual stocks. Not speculative positions. A basket of productive businesses reflecting the long-term growth of the economy as a whole. Fixed schedule. No market timing. No reaction to news. Contribute. Wait. Let time work. In the early years, the numbers are small, almost invisible. This is normal. The engine is building. You cannot see it clearly yet. But it is there, and it is accelerating. Stage 3, freedom. The point where the return generated by accumulated assets covers basic living costs. At this moment, something fundamental changes. You no longer have to sell your time to survive. You may still choose to work. Many people do. Work provides structure and meaning that money cannot replace. But the compulsion is gone. You have options, real ones. You have crossed to the other side. The compounding that was working against you is now working for you. Every morning you wake up marginally better off than the night before. Take a moment. Step back from the Sunday night calculation, from the rent, the car payment, the grocery money, and imagine something different. You are 80 years old. You are sitting somewhere quiet, a porch, a window with a long view, and you are not thinking about numbers. Numbers are just numbers from that chair. You are thinking about moments. The Sunday night you stopped staring at the ceiling and opened a separate account and put $1,000 in it and made one quiet decision. This number does not go below 1,000, ever. The 6 months you eliminated everything unnecessary. Sat with the discomfort. Let your brain find a different source of satisfaction than spending. The evening you picked up a resource on a second skill that nobody around you thought was worth the time. The year you changed the ratio. What occupied the majority of your mind? Whose thinking you allowed to be the dominant input? The morning you made the first contribution, almost embarrassingly small, but on a fixed schedule. And then again, and again. The years you kept going when the numbers seemed too small to matter, until one morning they were not. From that chair looking back, you can see something you could not see at the time. Every one of those moments was a choice. Quiet, unremarkable. Made when nobody was watching. Made when the people around you thought it was not worth it. To apply a documented framework to your actual life, not the life you were waiting to live, the one you were already in. And those choices, compounded quietly over years, changed everything. The buffer gave your brain back to you. The reset changed your relationship with money. The second skill removed the ceiling. The ratio change rebuilt the operating system in your mind. And the crossing moved you from one side of the equation to the other. None of it felt significant when it was happening. That is the nature of the right decision. It almost never announces itself. It sits there quietly, waiting to be made. From that chair at 80, you know exactly what you were doing in each one of those moments. Building a different architecture, one that worked for you instead of against you. That is the only thing that ever mattered. Not the advantages you did not have, not the circumstances you started in, not how hard you worked, whether you understood the structure you were operating inside, and whether you had the patience to build your way out of it. Buffett's framework is not complicated. It never was. It requires something most financial advice never asks for. Not speed, not luck, not a perfect starting point. Patience. And the willingness to build quietly when nobody is watching. If this framework gave you clarity on where to begin, consider subscribing to this channel. Every video on Buffett's principles applies Warren Buffett's publicly documented philosophy to the real financial challenges facing working people today. Thank you for watching.